Hello, my name is Val Myers. I am standing in Grade School Park, Manier, Illinois, the town that I chose to be my home almost 160 years ago. Behind me is a memorial to the brave souls that fought in the American Civil War. This monument has been restored. I was a soldier in the Union Army for 2 years, and I've been asked to return as a veteran and share with you some of my experiences from that turbulent time. I came to the United States in 1858, 2 years before the first states seceded from the Union. When war broke out in 1861, most of us in the northern states thought this conflict would be over in a short period of time, maybe as little as 90 days. It took us a full year to realize the resolve and strength of the Confederacy. In 1862, when President Lincoln made the call for 600,000 more men to serve their country, I enlisted in the Union Army. Soldiers were getting $13 a month then, with the first month paid in advance, and we got a $10 signing bonus. I was assigned to Company H of the 115th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, and I held the rank of private throughout the war. Now, my life as a soldier was not a glamorous one. We had a lot of marching drills, and we had a lot of practice with our weapons, but we also had a lot of downtime. Quite frankly, we were bored much of the time. Whenever we had to move a great distance, normal supply lines couldn't keep pace. So we had to forage for ourselves to supplement the small amount of hardtack that we always carried with us. We were allowed to hunt wild game, and sometimes we would buy or borrow fruit, vegetables, eggs, and livestock from nearby residents. We could only hope when filling our canteens that we were upstream, if you get my meaning. Now, this was the first major conflict anywhere in the world to be fought mostly with rifled muskets. That swirling of grooves in the barrel of the gun put a spin on the bullet that stabilized its flight and gave it much greater distance and accuracy than the old smoothbore guns did. We used a new kind of bullet in those guns. They were in the shape of a cylinder with a coned head, and we called them a mini ball because they had been developed by the Frenchman Claude-Etienne Minié. The whole process of loading and firing a gun had become so streamlined that a well-trained soldier could now get off 2 shots in 1 minute. Now, there was a downside to these new guns. Those mini balls would tear into flesh, and they would shatter any bone they ran into. Anyone unfortunate to be in the direct path of a mini ball was likely to be mortally wounded. If an arm or a leg were hit, well, that limb would probably have to be amputated. Now, even though our weapons were modern for that time, medicine was not nearly as advanced. Doctors made no effort to sterilize their equipment or themselves when treating the sick and the wounded. That may help explain why for every man lost in this war to battle wounds, we lost another 2 men to disease and infection. In September of 1863, our unit and several others marched all day and all through the night into North Georgia to an area called Chickamauga Creek. Now, this was a strategic piece of land between Chattanooga, Tennessee and Atlanta, Georgia. Capturing that land would lead to the fall of Chattanooga, which was a major railway supply center for the Southern cause. Up to this point in the war, we had been on several scouting missions, and we had had a few skirmishes with the rebels, but this was going to be our first major fight. Once we arrived at the front lines, we were given very little time to rest or get something to eat. Our officers placed us behind rocks and trees on one side of a wide and rolling meadow. We could see the rebels maneuvering on the other side. Once we were all in position, our artillery opened up to soften their lines a bit. Of course, their cannon answered with the same tune. Well, after a while, the shelling stopped, and we got the order to attack. We came out from behind those rocks and trees like a single well-oiled machine. We were running and shouting at the top of our lungs. maybe with a little swearing thrown in. We went after those Johnny Rebs and we drove them back. Then they counterattacked and drove us back. These back and forth assaults went on for the better part of 3 days before our generals decided to abandon the fight. Now they say this was the last major victory for the Confederacy in the war between the states. But you know, I just don't understand how anyone could call this battle of Chickamauga Creek a victory. Why, there were almost 40,000 casualties when you count the men killed, wounded, and captured. I was one of those casualties. I was wounded and captured on the final day of that battle, and I spent the next 17 months in 5 different Confederate prison camps, including Andersonville in Georgia. Maybe you've heard some of the horror stories of those prison camps, including Andersonville. It truly was a hell on earth. It was partially laid out on swamp ground. Any trees in the area had been cut down and were serving as the barricade walls. There were no barracks or very few other structures inside that compound. Rather than looking like a place of human confinement, it resembled a cattle pen in both sight and smell. We had no protection from the rain or the searing heat of the day or the cold winter nights. The only shelter we had were the tents that we had carried in with us. Even though there was a small stream that meandered through this prison camp, fresh water was a very rare thing to find. Our rations were short and usually putrid. Latrines were somewhere between poorly constructed and non-existent. Everything was in such short supply that some of our own men took to robbing fellow prisoners of their food and clothing. I had someone watch my possessions while I slept, then I returned the favor to him. Well, after a few months of exposure to the elements and these living conditions, many of our men were in rags, if they were wearing anything at all. We lost as many as 20 men every day to dysentery, scurvy, malaria, and from wandering into the dead zone. Now that was an area 18 to 20 feet inside the perimeter of the barricade walls where the guards had permission to shoot any prisoner venturing there. I am convinced that some of my fellow prisoners intentionally went into that zone. They were willing to accept an immediate death rather than continue with their daily suffering. Now, while I was being held there at Andersonville, our General Sherman began his March to the Sea, a slash and burn battle plan designed to cut the Confederacy in half and hopefully shorten the war. The commanders at our prison camp were afraid that Sherman would come our way and set us prisoners free, and that we would then be returned to serving in the Union Army. So those of us that still had enough strength to walk were transferred to a prison camp at Florence, South Carolina. I'll tell you, conditions there were not much better than they had been at Andersonville. It was at that South Carolina camp that I volunteered to be a surgeon's nurse. I felt this would be a better use of my time than to sit idle all day, dwelling on how bad our conditions were. I became acquainted with another prisoner being held there, John January from Minonk, Illinois. Now, Mr. January was suffering terribly from malnutrition, and he had gangrene in both feet. Imagine the worst odor you have ever encountered. Multiply that tenfold, and you'll have an idea of what it's like to be around rotting flesh caused by gangrene. Well, Mr. January was destined to die unless those infected feet were removed, and removed very soon. I alerted one of the doctors to his plight, but he refused to operate, saying, "Why, that man's going to die soon anyway, and I want him to go to heaven with his feet still attached." Well, another nurse and I felt differently. We carried Mr. January to a surgical table. With the other gentleman assisting, I amputated both those feet, about 5 inches above each ankle, with a pocket knife. Now, it wasn't all that difficult, really, because the gangrene had rotted even his bones, making my job somewhat easier. Well, Mr. January survived that operation, and we both survived the prison camps. We were liberated by Union troops in February of 1865. The war was over just 2 months later in April when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Now, there's always some confusion and delay in ending any war, and these factors seem to be magnified with President Lincoln's assassination less than a week after that surrender. It seemed to me that from that point on, military decisions were being made about as swiftly as you can pour molasses in the middle of winter. And that may explain why it took another 3 months before I was mustered out of the Army. Well, by the time I returned to Manier in July of '65, I had saved enough money to buy my first 80 acres of land. It was at the inflated price of $12 an acre. I hope you aren't having to pay that much for farmland now. About a year after I returned from the war, I married Katharina Graff. Now, she had come to the United States with her family back in '58 on the same ship that I had. Well, I hadn't paid any attention to her then. At that time, she was a mere child of 11, and I was a 24-year-old man. But when I returned from the war, she was 18, and, well, she had changed. She had changed a lot. Eventually, we had more than 500 acres to support us and our 7 children. I was one of the founders of St. John's Church here in Manier. Back in those days, everyone just called it the German Church. I had a sense of civic duty, and so I served as the road commissioner here for several years, and I served a few years on the school board. I am also quite proud of my membership in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. That organization sought for the preservation and enhancement of benefits for those of us that had served in that late great unpleasantness. Well, long after the war and long after my years of farming and public service, I got a really nice surprise. Remember that Mr. January I was telling you about? Well, he came to visit me here in Manier around 1906, I believe it was. And by then, he had recovered from his prison weight of 45 pounds to a more robust 200 pounds. And he was wearing prosthetic feet, walking only slightly with a limp. I think I have a photo of him over here someplace. Well, I died the following year, 1907, at the ripe old age of 73. I spend my time out at Manier Cemetery now, next to Katharina, and I probably should be getting back out there now. She gets concerned if I'm gone very long. I thank you folks for listening to my tale today. Auf Wiedersehen und Gottes Segen. Goodbye, and God bless you.